When you want to own the sky, it pays to rely on experience. Lockheed Martin sets the standard in aviation technology, building combat-proven fighters like the F-35, F-22, and F-16. We put innovation above all, turning cutting-edge ideas into unmatched air power. We connect pilots, drones, and data into a seamless dome of security. This is air dominance. Lockheed Martin, ensuring those we serve always stay ahead of ready.
I'm Ben Watson, and welcome to Defense One Radio. This episode, we're going to hear from Virginia's Representative Rob Wittman, who joined us for our recent State of Defense Business Acquisition Summit in Washington. Defense One Executive Editor Bradley Penniston spoke to the congressman shortly after Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth announced a shakeup to the way the U.S. military does business with both the leading as well as emerging, or perhaps lesser-known defense contractors. Now, here's Defense One's Bradley Penniston.
I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Congressman Rob Wittman of Virginia. He is Vice Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. He is Co-Chairman of the recently relaunched Bipartisan Defense Modernization Caucus. And of course, he is a longtime member of the congressional cohort that cares very deeply about defense industrial issues. So we are delighted to have Congressman Wittman joining us for the second straight year here. We had this conversation last year, and a lot of water is under the bridge. Come on up. We were just talking about the new modernization approach that Secretary Hegseth rolled out just a few weeks ago. A sea change probably in the way the Pentagon buys stuff. And I'd like to start off by asking you, what you make of it and what your colleagues on Capitol Hill make of it.
Sure. There's a lot of similarities between what the Secretary's rolled out and what is contained in the SPEED Act, which is the House version of acquisition reform, and the FORGED Act, which is the Senate version of acquisition reform. And if you look at the mix there, the House's version really focused on achieving mission outcomes. So it's much more outcome-based. The Senate version was more about governance. How do we change the issues there of governance? And some of the things that we saw there that I think are really a transformational time frames. The average acquisition process in the Pentagon is 800 days. This is going to change it to 90 to 120 days. So things are going to happen really fast. The things that we're used to, the JSIDS process where you go through long iterations of developing requirements and taking years to go ahead and do that, and then thousands of pages of requirements that any human being reads and they go, what in the heck is this? Changing that. Changing how we do modular open systems architecture, those things are going to be key. Opening up the aperture even more, making it easier to use other transaction authorities, changing the PEOs to PAOs, program acquisition executives, and then making those billets, some of the language I had in there is taking those billets that are now 3-year billets, turning them into 6-year billets. So that's actually a longer term perspective for folks in those areas. I think this is the farthest reaching effort in acquisition reform in the history of DoD. And a lot of what the House and Senate are doing, which will come to the floor in the NDAA in the next several weeks, is reflected in some of the things that the Pentagon's doing. So there is an awful lot of alignment there. I think it's massive in how things change. And the best way I can describe it is today the process is this. You have the warfighter that says, I need an apple. And then the program requirement writers go, okay, well, tell me what the apple is. So they describe the apple to the program writers, and they put down that 2,000-3,000 page description under the JSIDS process of what the apple is. And you read that, and the description actually reads like it's a pear. So then the program office, the requirement writers go to the program office and said, okay, we want you to put a request for proposals out for this. So the people read that description and go, well, I read this and boy, it sure reads like to me that they want an orange. So they go ahead and put together an orange, and then they send it back, and then the program office goes, well, we got to test this. We got to make sure that the orange is really doing what it's supposed to do. So they go test it, and they go, we got to make some changes to this because we don't think that it quite measures up to the requirements. So then they end up producing a pineapple. And then they hand the pineapple to the warfighter, and the warfighter goes, what the did you just give me? But to the warfighter's credit, they take their K-bar out and their knife out and they cut the top off or they cut the rind off and they shape it into what looks like an apple. And they goes, it's not an apple, it's a pineapple, but I think we can turn it into something that works. What we want to do is to make sure that in conjunction with the Secretary of Defense, the Senate and the House, is that we have a process that when somebody asks for an apple, that's exactly what they get. And they get an apple instead of waiting years to get an apple, they get an apple in months. Yeah.
So I've heard some conversations that say, yes, we would love to get much cheaper apples. We'd like to get them faster.
Yes.
We'd like to get them where industry says, okay, well, this is what we can do, and we think the warfighter can use this. But I've also heard from people who say, look, we're building aircraft carriers and destroyers and bombers that are much more complicated than apples.
Yes.
And will this new process prejudice that the more complex things that we do need? Occasionally you do need an exquisite weapon system.
Sure.
And will this process support that?
I think it will. I think there has to be a meshing of the two concepts. I think you can have those exquisite platforms that have cutting edge technology, but you can use off the shelf elements for much of what goes on there. I mean, a great example is when I went out on the Gerald R4, the first of the Ford class aircraft carriers, the new multi-array radar was not ready to go on board, but they wanted to go ahead and make sure they took the aircraft carrier through sea trials. So you know what they did? They went and bought an off-the-shelf Raytheon radar. And guess what? When I talked to the folks on the ship there and who were operating the flight boss, and I said, hey, how's it operating? They go, actually doing pretty good. So, to be able to take off-the-shelf technology, put it into these exquisite systems where necessary. If we have the cutting-edge technology, we ought to be using it. But remember, our suite of capabilities within the Pentagon, within the Department of Defense, but also within the service branches, is not just going to be exquisite platforms. It will be expendables and attritables. And expendable and attritables are perfectly suited for off-the-shelf technology, for platforms that can be reprogrammed on a daily basis. So the Pentagon's going to have to also change its mindset from a hardware-centric organization to a software-centric organization. It's going to be, how do we use software to enable hardware? How do we use it to enable things that maybe even are kind of outside the box? You may look at this off-the-shelf technology and go, well, it's normally used for this, but maybe we can program it a little bit different way to be used for a different purpose that suits the military. And I talk about things like counter UAS. Those things are really an exciting emerging part of that. That's all going to be part of a fabric of how we create a military force that deters and can, I argue, increase the risk calculus for the Chinese. I mean, really, when you look at the future battle space, it really is going to be kind of like a calculus problem. I mean, I remember having nightmares about solving for the unknown as a calculus student. Really what we want to do is we want to make China have to solve for the unknown every day. And when we make them do that, guess what? All of a sudden Xi goes, well, maybe not today, because we're not quite sure what the U.S. can do. So it'll be a combination of all those things, and we can use a lot of the current technologies, and I would argue even push the exquisite systems to places where before we've taken years to do those things. And exquisite systems are great, but the challenge is when it takes you years to deliver that exquisite system, when it takes you, we are now on year 24 for the F-35, starting from a blank sheet of paper to today, full rate production. We can't do that anymore. So I want to make sure that we are, working at the speed of relevance. You look at what the Chinese do, they do some pretty mind-boggling things, and they do it much faster than we do it. We have to have the right combination of being able to use those technologies off the shelf, make sure they're software driven, make sure too that they can adapt literally on a minute by minute, day by day basis. And when we do, I think we can really create significant deterrence for the Chinese. I mean, the greatest lesson is what's happening in Ukraine, and you see what's happening between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and pretty resourceful in the things that are happening there. A great laboratory and lessons here for the United States.
All right, so the Pentagon is embarking on what you see as the biggest reform, possibly ever.
Yes.
And there have been many reform efforts in the past. What is Congress's role in making sure this sticks?
That's a great question. We've done things in the past, and the Pentagon has sort of resisted that and said, no, we'll do things at our pace, or the things that they may not agree with is to slow play. The good thing about this effort is that this effort is going to be directly tied to resourcing those particular efforts. And listen, the committees have the wherewithal to say whether or not they will allow reprogramming of monies. So even if dollars are slow played and there's some concern that, well, maybe they're not going to spend the money the way Congress wants them to do, one place where we do have some power is to say, if you don't use it for what we want you to use it for, then we just won't allow reprogramming. In the past, reprogrammings have sort of been automatic. And then also making sure, too, that we use other tools there that require these dollars to be used in specific ways. We can always put language in there that fences those resources and say, if you're not using them for this, then guess what? Resources will come from somewhere else, or you won't be able to reuse these resources elsewhere. We'll gather those up and put them into another place, which kind of gives, I would argue, an equal positive incentive and negative incentive to use the resources the right ways.
So I get all that, but one of the changes that Secretary Hegseth is pushing and that you are touting is the idea that instead of constraining these pools of money to a single PEO, you'll have a larger program portfolio manager who can move money around in that.
Yes.
And does that work against Congress's power of the purse?
Well, I think as long as it's being executed within the parameters that Congress defines, I think that there is some flexibility, but not unlimited flexibility. You can't go in and say, well, there's money in the budget for FAXX, and guess what? We're not going to put the money into that. We're going to put it into next generation air defense on another side of things. They don't get to decide at that particular level. But if under FAXX, they're saying we have 4 parallel tracks in developing the next generation systems for guidance, for aerodynamics, for performance, for thrust in engines. If you look at that and said, well, listen, we're making a little more advance in the engine design. Let's move a little more money towards the engine design so we can really move that forward quickly. I think that's the flexibility that you want within those program areas. But you don't want to say, hey, we're going to move FAXX dollars, which is a Navy platform needed for aircraft carriers, over to NGAD, which is going to be an Air Force platform that's very different mission set. I don't think that you can make those sorts of moves because that's not what Congress intended.
When you want to own the sky, it pays to rely on experience. Lockheed Martin sets the standard in aviation technology, building combat-proven fighters like the F-35, F-22, and F-16. We put innovation above all, turning cutting-edge ideas into unmatched air power. We connect pilots, drones, and data into a seamless dome of security. This is air dominance. Lockheed Martin, ensuring those we serve always stay ahead of ready.
Well, speaking of communication between the Pentagon and Congress, another thing that Secretary Hegseth has done is he has bottlenecked communications. He has said all communications from the Pentagon to Capitol Hill must go through OSD's Ledge Affairs Office.
Sure.
This is a big change from the way it's been. How is that viewed? How do you view that, and how do your colleagues view that?
Well, remember, fundamentally, things haven't changed. Fundamentally is when a member of Congress asks a member of the military for their professional military judgment, under the law, that military member is required to give that. So they may have to go up the chain of command and go, by the way, Rob Wittman called me today and asked me a question and I answered it. But what I don't believe is the intent of this is that any communication has to be pre-approved by somebody in OSD. I understand wanting to know where the discussions have taken place and what the discussions are related to, but under the law, there's not a pre-decisional or pre-approval that's necessary in order for those communications to take place. Anything that we can do to encourage those communications, I think, is key. So there has to really be an open door. We have to make sure that we can call the folks in the program offices, the service branch chiefs, whatever it may be, the unit commanders, and said, by the way, what's going on with this? And they have to be able to give us their unvarnished professional military judgment on that in order for us to make decisions. So I don't see that it changes any of that. As far as how they manage it internally within the Pentagon, that's certainly now a structure that they're going to have to abide by. But I can tell you that in my mind, there is not any need for pre-approval for communications with members of Congress.
Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about what comes next.
Sure.
The NDAA is under construction.
Yes.
The process is perhaps full of delay and confusion. Now more than ever. But tell me about your priorities in the NDAA and how you think they're being addressed.
Sure. Well, the NDA is making great progress. I think we are just about finished with all the issues involving HASC and SASC. The other issues remaining to be resolved are issues having to do with other committee jurisdictions. And those mostly are relegated to the Senate bill. So they're trying to work through those particular issues. I think that those will hopefully be done by the end of the week, and then the bill will be in its final form. It should be on the floor at the beginning of the second week of December. I think there's some pretty important parts of what's in this bill. We've done some things to really open the aperture for private equity investments through the Office of Strategic Capital to leverage more private dollars into the defense development R&D stream. I think that's going to be key. Looking too at how we've changed the PAEs now, as they're called, from a 3-year billet to a 6-year billet to make sure we give more certainty there. Those individuals can continue on their promotion path, but they're going to be in that program and have some long-term interest to make sure that they are willing to take some risks. Try. It's not a bad thing to fail, but you have enough time to where you not have to worry about failure, or where you can jump in and try something and say, hey, that didn't work. Let's keep doing some different things.
Just on that, before we move on,
Sure.
Do we think that the people who would have been 3-year PAOs are really going to want to be 6-year PAEs?
Well, I think as long as it doesn't interfere with the promotion process, I think they will. And we've been clear that this does not interfere with the promotion process. So there's nothing that prevents somebody that goes in to a PAE position as a 2-star to come out as a 3-star, or for that matter, even a 4-star. And remember too, if you build your bona fides there by saying, hey, I really was aggressive, I managed a program, we tried some things. I argue that trying and failing is as important as showing that you've been able to succeed, because the lessons you learn through failure sometimes are the most important ones. And the great model we see today are companies like SpaceX and now others. Look at what China's doing with their space program. China knows that in order to make timely advancements, they're sort of adopting the same model as SpaceX is. Work at a breakneck pace, do lots of things, don't worry about failure. If we fail, we're going to put it back together tomorrow, learn from that failure and move on. I think that same sort of mindset can now occur within a PAE office with somebody that comes in and aggressively says we're going to do those things. And reducing the number of PAEs too assures that there's more cross-pollination with the things that are happening within those program areas to make sure that there's a better vision about what the outcome is, the mission outcome, than right now saying, I just have to manage my program. And I think what happens now is, it takes you the first year to figure out what's the program's all about, because many times these folks come from the operational side. So they come from the fleet, they come from a division command, and they get thrown into a PEO office, and then they got to learn the program. And then their first course, they go to Defense Acquisition University, and what are they handed? They're handed an 1,800-page manual, which, by the way, is almost double the size of the total works of William Shakespeare. And they're handed that and going, this is what you're going to do. So what's the message they get? Process, process, process. We don't care about outcomes. We care about process. Follow the manual. So when you go through there and you get your Defense Acquisition University education, and you are given the Defense Acquisition Manual, and you read that, and my emphasis is make sure I follow the manual, instead of saying, how do I learn to be a good business manager? How do I learn simple things like the functions of the executive? A book written by Herbert Simon that was written, 80 years ago, but is pertinent today. How do they learn to be a good manager? How do they learn to put resources together? None of those things are taught in this. So it changes the mindset about how PAEs work and how they will function. And bringing that sort of knowledge will make them better, because they'll have some experience on the operational side, but they should be, as part of this, good managers in how they manage these programs.
All right. Well, we'll see. The military has never been particularly known for forgiving failure, though. No. I take your point as, it's not a failure if you learn from it, but it'll be interesting to see if the culture of the people who look to, the PAEs can accept that.
Well, and it has to start at Congress. I mean, we can't lecture and say, take risks, and then the first time there's a failure, we call somebody up on Capitol Hill and bang the table and holler and scream and go, how did you do this? How could this happen? Because guess what? That behavior will stop in a heartbeat when somebody goes, you know what? I watched them grill this PAE up on Capitol Hill. I'm not going to do that, so I'm not going to take any risks. And what we want is for them to be able to do that. What we need to do is the opposite. We need to pull people up on Capitol Hill that can say, hey, I tried some things, but let me tell you what I learned from that. Let me tell you why it led to the next generation of success. Those are the people we need to bring up to Capitol Hill and say, tell us about how this happened.
All right. Well, I interrupted you midway through talking about the NDAA. Let's maybe focus on shipbuilding, of course. It's near and dear to your constituents' hearts.
Mm-hmm.
We talked last year about your hopes for the Navy to advance its own approach to buying and building ships. How do you think they're doing?
Listen, I think they're doing marginally better. I think the bottom line is this. We went through a hiccup with COVID. The biggest issue that the Navy has to deal with now is workforce, in regenerating the workforce of the future. And the world we live in today for developing workforce is very different than it was pre-COVID. The expectations of individuals, it used to be you could go to work at the shipyard and your wage or salary was significantly greater than anything else that you could do within that area of expertise and skills. Today, it's not the case. I mean, I remember going to Electric Boat and driving down the road and driving past a Chick-fil-A. And the sign in the window said, employees wanted $18 an hour, full benefits, shared educational expenses. And I went to the yard and I asked them, it said, how much are you paying your new shipbuilders to come in the yard? I said, we're paying them $20 an hour. And I said, and you're asking them to work out in these conditions, in the cold and these tough conditions. And they've got a choice between making $18 an hour with full benefits, same benefits package at Chick-fil-A, and working inside serving chicken sandwiches for $2 an hour less. I said, you're not out there attracting folks to come to the shipyard. So what they did, to their credit, is they said, we have to make the wage scale significantly different than other areas of not even comparable skills, but places where you need even more skills. So I think they're making that transition. Another thing too is to look at, how are we going to replace the workers that are retiring? If you look at a place like HII, they're on track to need 5,000 new shipyard workers annually. 5,000. That's a significant number. That's a tough recruitment realm to go through. Now, they are being more successful these days. They have a number of career and technical education centers that are feeder spots for them, things like Tidewater Community College and some of the high schools there, and the career and technical education training centers are creating a pipeline for these students. But it still has to be where you go to the shipyard because it's marginally, or not marginally, but it's significantly better, not marginally better than other wage scales and other work conditions. And it's other things too. When you go to HII and you go there, and I'll go there a number of times, get there early in the morning when the first shift shows up, 5 o'clock, and you've got people that have been sleeping in their car since 3:30 to get a parking place. Guess what? That's a tough gig. And this is somebody too that now has traveled an hour to get there. I mean, where I live, people get on buses. There's a bus service that goes from where I live, which is 2 hours to the shipyard. People get on the bus at 3 o'clock in the morning to make it to the shipyard gate by 5 o'clock for first shift. So that's significant. So the draw area is big, but if you're going to get up 3 o'clock every morning to do that 5 days a week, it better be worth the while. And what you're finding is the salary or wage scale differential through the years post-COVID has closed because the competition for workforce has gone through the ceiling. So that's the biggest issue for the shipyard. And then two, it's modernizing process there to get better at building ships. And there's been a lot of effort here to partner with others. HII partnered with Hyundai. You see the purchase of the Philly shipyard and other companies that come in that have a different way of process and how to build ships. We have to do more of that, and we have to use more additive manufacturing. There are a lot of things that we can do with advanced metals today using additive manufacturing that have never been available before. If you're relying on castings where it takes months to produce a casting and then get it machined and then put it on a ship versus being able to right there on the yard, go to a digital printer and digital print the same part in 48 hours, those are the things we need to do. In Virginia, we have the Virginia Advanced Manufacturing Center in Danville that's training the next generation shipbuilders to build the Columbia class. I would argue it needs to be more than just Columbia class construction. So there are things that have to happen. I think the challenge for the industry is it has to happen faster. Mm-hmm. The industry's taken the right direction. The key is how do they press the gas pedal? They have to be all in on this because, we don't have the luxury of time. And when China has 238 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States. It's not like if we double our capacity, we're going to close the gap.
10x, right? Exactly,
Yeah.
or more. So what's Congress's role in getting the shipyards to move more quickly on this?
Well, first of all, there has to be proper resourcing, but it's not just money. You just can't throw money at the problem. It has to be, how do you make sure the dollars that are being invested are producing outcomes? So it has to be performance-based dollars. How are we encouraging the right investments? How are we encouraging investment in the workforce? How do we grow that workforce at a pace and sustain that pace? I would argue we still have a little ways to go there. We saw the SAWS Act, which is an effort to try to improve some of the wage scales and the dollars that are put into workforce. That didn't by itself pass, but in the reconciliation bill, we are able to put some additional dollars into shipbuilding, which will go to workforce. So we're taking some of the first steps there. Remember, too, that has to also now be reflected. You can't just do a one-time surge of money in there, because those wage scale increases have to be reflected in the contract cost. You can't look at a ship that takes 6 years to build and say, well, we're gonna pay shipyard workers a little bit additional for the first 2 years of the contract, because that's the money we have, and then the remaining 4 years, where does that come from? So we have to look at ways to be able to continue that. I think that there are ways we can make that happen, but it really is critically important that we get that done.
All right, looks like we have about 2 minutes left. Let me
Okay.
slide in one more question.
Sure.
Congress has in the past been very skeptical about the Navy's planned path for underwater drones, or I should say maritime drones,
Yeah.
on, above, and under the water. How are you looking at their plans now?
Listen, I think they're making some good progress. I remember going to Newport, going there to the lab and seeing all kinds of great research projects. But when I asked when's the down select going to happen, people looked at me like, what are you talking about down select? We're just having fun experimenting with these platforms. So it's about selecting. I think the Navy has finally gotten to that place. The key is not just now down selecting, but how do you go to scale quickly with those operations? We're seeing some exciting things happening there. We see a company that's building unmanned surface ships. Pretty incredible the pace at which they're doing it. So that tells me that you can do the same with UUVs. So the key is how do we make sure that we are not only awarding contracts, but awarding contracts at scale and with timeliness, and that is performing and delivering those platforms within very strict timeframes. And it's pretty incredible. I met with the company the other day. In fact, was on a panel yesterday with the chairman of that company, and they're building not only the smaller unmanned surface vessels, but the larger ones now. They're building 150-foot unmanned surface vessels, and they are there in the yard. They're building 2 right now in a yard. They started in June. They'll have those ships finished by December.
All right. Well,
That's
we'll
the
look
kind
for
of
that.
pace we need. Yeah.
All right. Well, Congressman, we could obviously go on for
Yeah.
quite some time
Yeah.
like this, but I do thank you for your time and your comments.
Brad,
and
thank you.
Let's have a
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for us this episode. Thanks for listening, and until next time.
When you want to own the sky, it pays to rely on experience. Lockheed Martin sets the standard in aviation technology, building combat-proven fighters like the F-35, F-22, and F-16. We put innovation above all, turning cutting-edge ideas into unmatched air power. We connect pilots, drones, and data into a seamless dome of security. This is air dominance. Lockheed Martin, ensuring those we serve always stay ahead of ready.